Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in American history. Today, we'll delve into a mystery that has remained unsolved for over a century, buried in the dark mountains of North Carolina. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching this video from. I'd love to hear from anyone who's joining us on this investigation. It was the year 1912. The world had not yet experienced the horrors of the Great War, but in the isolated regions of the Appalachian Mountains, other kinds of terror already inhabited the imaginations of small communities. North Carolina was then a state of violent contrasts. While cities like Charlotte and Raleigh were experiencing the first stirrings of modernity, with electric streetcars and expanding textile mills, the mountains to the west remained virtually untouched by progress. There, among mist-covered peaks and deep valleys where the sun barely penetrated, lived families following centuries-old traditions, many of them descendants of the first Scottish and Irish settlers who crossed the Atlantic Ocean centuries earlier. The Appalachian Mountains in that region formed a natural labyrinth of narrow trails, unexplored caves, and forests so dense that even the most experienced hunters hesitated to venture out alone. Wildlife included black bears, bobcats, and venomous snakes, but the real danger, as many locals whispered around campfires, didn't always come from nature. There were old stories of people who entered those woods and simply disappeared, as if the mountain had opened its mouth and swallowed them whole. Margaret Hale was 23 when her name became synonymous with one of the most disturbing enigmas ever recorded in that region. She was not a dramatic or controversial figure. On the contrary, she was described by all who knew her as an ordinary young woman with a gentle disposition and a shy smile. The daughter of a small Haywood County farmer, Margaret grew up helping her mother with the housework and caring for her younger siblings. Her father, a stern but fair man, grew tobacco and corn on land that had belonged to the family for 3 generations. Life was difficult but predictable until it wasn't. In early March of that year, Margaret was supposed to be on a simple trip. Her maternal aunt, who lived on a property about 15 kilometers away, had fallen seriously ill. The woman had no children of her own, and Margaret, always devoted to her family, offered to spend a few days caring for her. The journey required crossing 2 small mountains and following a trail known locally as the Cedar Way because of the ancient trees that lined the route. It was a route Margaret had taken before, always accompanied but never alone. On the morning of March 15th, a grey day with low clouds threatening rain, Margaret said goodbye to her parents. He carried a bundle of clothes, some food wrapped in cloth, and a small vial of medicine her mother had prepared with medicinal herbs. She wore a dark blue dress, a woolen shawl, and worn leather boots. Her father hesitated to let her go alone, but circumstances offered no alternative. His brothers were busy with the spring planting, and he himself could not abandon the work. Margaret reassured everyone, saying she knew the route well and would arrive before nightfall. She never made it to her aunt's house, and even more disturbing, she was never seen alive again. When dusk fell over the mountains that Friday and Margaret didn't appear, her aunt began to worry. She sent a neighbor to check if something had happened. The man returned, following the same trail Margaret would have taken, but found no sign of the young woman. By the time they reached the Hale farm, it was already dark, and the news that Margaret hadn't arrived turned their worry into outright panic. Her father immediately organized a search party. About 20 men from the community, armed with flashlights, torches, and rifles, set out in the early hours of Saturday morning. They searched the cedar trail inch by inch, calling Margaret's name until they were hoarse. The trail showed no signs of struggle or violence. There was no blood, no torn fabric or drag marks. It was as if Margaret had simply evaporated into the thin mountain air. For 3 days, the search continued relentlessly. Experienced men, who knew every rock and tree in the land, explored areas increasingly distant from the original route. They checked caves, ravines, and even old abandoned wells. They questioned all the residents of the nearby properties, but no one had seen Margaret pass by. It was as if she had been erased from existence the very moment she left her parents' house. The entire community was in shock. Women prayed in their churches. Men organized increasingly desperate search parties. The county sheriff was notified and arrived with 2 deputies, but even with official reinforcements, no concrete leads emerged. The mountains guarded their secret with impenetrable silence. Then, on the morning of March 19th, everything changed. A young hunter named Thomas Brennan, familiar with seldom-traveled back trails, decided to explore a more remote area, following a dark hunch. He climbed a steep path that led to a rocky plateau known locally as Raven Rock, a place avoided by most due to ancient superstitions. There, in a small clearing surrounded by gnarled oaks, Thomas found something that would make his blood run cold. Try again. I'll continue edit part 2. What Thomas Brennan discovered that cold March morning transcended any rational explanation Appalachian mountain dwellers could offer. Raven Rock was an isolated rocky outcrop located nearly 2 miles from the Cedar Trail. Reaching it required a complete detour from Margaret's intended route, climbing steep slopes covered in dense vegetation and crossing an icy stream that ran between slippery rocks. There was no logical reason for anyone to make that journey, especially a young woman carrying belongings alone and in a hurry to reach her destination before nightfall. Thomas approached the clearing cautiously. The silence there was different, heavier, as if even the birds and insects avoided this place. In the center of the open space, surrounded by a near-perfect circle of stones that seemed to have been intentionally placed, lay the body of Margaret Hale. She lay on her back, her arms extended at her sides, in an oddly symmetrical, almost ceremonial position. Her open eyes stared up at the gray sky, and an expression Thomas could never adequately describe etched on her face. It wasn't exactly fear nor pain. It was something deeper, more disturbing, a kind of transcendent terror, as if she had seen something the human mind was not meant to witness. The dark blue dress Margaret wore when she left home was intact, without rips or mud stains, despite the impossible distance from the main trail. Her boots were clean without the signs of wear one would expect after a forced trek over uneven terrain. The bundle of clothes and the medicine bottle were positioned beside her, carefully arranged, as if someone wanted to preserve order and respect. But the most disturbing detail, the one that would keep investigators awake for weeks to come, was in Margaret's hands. She held a small branch of hemlock, a poisonous plant known locally but not known to grow naturally at this altitude. Her hands were clasped tightly around the branch, her pale fingers intertwined as if she had clutched it in her final moments of life. And there was more. Around Margaret's neck, someone had placed a rudimentary necklace made of woven twigs and small bird bones. It wasn't something she wore when she left home. Her parents would later confirm this, horrified. This disturbing object had been placed there by someone else. Thomas ran down the mountain to get help, stumbling over his own legs, his breathing heavy not only from the physical exertion, but from the horror of what he had witnessed. When the sheriff and a group of men arrived at Crow Rock a few hours later, the scene remained exactly as Thomas had described. The county doctor, a white-haired man named Dr. Jonathan Pritchard, was called to examine the body. He worked in silence, kneeling beside Margaret while the other men kept a respectful distance, many of them unable to look directly at the scene. Dr. Pritchard found no signs of apparent physical violence. There were no wounds, bruises, or signs of strangulation. Margaret's clothes were in place with no indication of assault. The doctor carefully inspected every visible part of her body, making notes in a small notebook with slightly trembling hands. He estimated that death had occurred 3 to 4 days earlier, meaning Margaret likely died on the same Friday she disappeared, or at the latest the following Saturday. The cause of death, however, remained a complete mystery. There was no explanation for why a healthy 23-year-old woman had simply ceased to live. The hemlock branch in Margaret's hands raised the first disturbing theory. Had she ingested some part of the poisonous plant? But why? Margaret showed no signs of depression or despair. Her family insisted she was fine, even excited about the prospect of helping her sick aunt. And even if she had decided to take her own life, why would she have walked miles across impossible terrain to an isolated location she likely didn't even know? And who had placed that macabre necklace around her neck? The sheriff ordered the body transported back to town. 6 men descended the mountain, carrying Margaret on a makeshift stretcher, a silent and somber procession that would be remembered for decades. News of the discovery spread quickly through neighboring communities. What had begun as a desperate search for a missing young woman had transformed into something far more sinister, a riddle that defied all logic and reason. Over the next few days, the sheriff conducted extensive interrogations. He questioned Thomas Brennan repeatedly, initially suspecting the young hunter might be involved. After all, how had he known exactly where to look? Why had he decided to climb to Raven Rock, a location that wasn't even part of the official search area? Thomas swore under all possible sanctions that he had followed only a hunch, an inexplicable feeling that had led him there. Several residents confirmed that Thomas was a reputable, hard-working and honest young man. There was no reason to suspect him beyond the disturbing coincidence that he was the one who found the body. The sheriff then turned his attention to Margaret's family. Was there some secret, some conflict that could explain what had happened? The parents were questioned about their daughter's personal life. Did Margaret have any suitors? Had she suffered any recent heartbreak? Was she corresponding with anyone outside the region? Each question yielded the same answer. Margaret was a reserved young woman, devoted to her family, with no known romantic involvements. Her life was simple and predictable, revolving around household chores and family obligations. The Aunt Margaret intended to visit was heard in her sickbed. The woman, already frail from the illness, was even more debilitated upon learning of her niece's death. Through tears she confirmed that she had sent a message asking for help, but she never imagined it would result in tragedy. She knew no one who would wish Margaret ill. The young woman was loved by all who knew her. Meanwhile, rumors began to spread through the mountains like wildfire. Ancient superstitions, those passed down from generation to generation since the days of the first settlers, resurfaced with renewed force. People spoke in hushed tones about the legends of Raven Rock, a place that had always been considered cursed by the elders. They said that decades, perhaps even centuries ago, something terrible had happened there. Some spoke of dark rituals performed by hermits who lived secluded in the mountains. Others spoke of vengeful spirits inhabiting the highest peaks, entities that lured unsuspecting travelers into deadly traps. The pastor of the local Baptist church, a pragmatic man named Reverend Samuel Kirby, tried to calm the situation during Margaret's funeral. He preached about the mysteries of divine will and the need to trust in heavenly justice when earthly justice fails. But even his steady voice carried a note of uncertainty. Everyone sensed something profoundly wrong with the death, something that transcended conventional explanations of accident or common foul play. Margaret was buried in the small churchyard on a rainy March afternoon. Dozens of mourners attended, many from distant communities. Margaret's mother collapsed on the coffin, her sobs echoing among the ancient headstones. Her father stood, rigid as a stone statue, his eyes fixed on some distant point in the mountains, as if searching for answers in the very rock formations that had swallowed his daughter. Try again, continue. Edit. Part 3. The weeks following Margaret Hale's funeral brought more questions than answers. The Haywood County Sheriff, a man named William Tesler, with over 20 years of law enforcement experience in these mountains, had never faced such a perplexing case. He was known for his methodical and rational approach, unfazed by superstition or fanciful stories. But even Tesler was beginning to sense there was something inexplicable about the death, something beyond conventional investigative methods. Determined to find a logical explanation, the sheriff organized a return expedition to Crow Rock. This time, he took with him not only deputies but also a state surveyor who was working in the area mapping the mountains. The goal was to document precisely where Margaret had been found and search for any evidence that might have been overlooked when the body was discovered. The expedition set out on a clear April morning, just as spring was finally beginning to warm the Appalachian foothills. What they found at Raven Rock only deepened the mystery. The circle of stones around where Margaret had been found was still intact. Sheriff Tesler ordered each stone examined, turned over, and inspected. They were common local stones, granite and quartz, with no inscriptions or special markings, but the circle's formation was disturbingly precise, almost geometric in its perfection. Someone had devoted considerable time to arranging those stones in that particular way. But when and why? The surveyor, a polite man named Henry Caldwell, took careful measurements and detailed notes. He confirmed that the site was 2.5 miles from the Cedar Trail, the trail Margaret would have followed. The most direct route between the 2 points would require traversing extremely difficult terrain, including a steep climb with a gradient of nearly 45 degrees in places. Caldwell, accustomed to mountain walking for his work, admitted that he would find the journey challenging even with proper equipment and daylight. For a young woman in long skirts and worn boots, carrying a bundle of belongings, it would be nearly impossible. Tesler then asked a crucial question. Was there another, easier route to Raven Rock? The surveyor studied his maps and considered the topography. There was an alternative trail, he explained, that wound around the base of the mountain and eventually ascended a gentler slope to the plateau. This route would be longer, adding perhaps 3 miles to the journey, but certainly more feasible for someone without climbing experience. The group decided to explore this route. As they descended the alternate trail, they made a disturbing discovery. In a narrow stretch between two rock formations, they found a piece of dark blue fabric attached to a low-hanging branch. The fabric was the same material as Margaret's dress. The sheriff carefully stored the evidence, marking the exact location in his notebook. This confirmed that Margaret had passed that way, but it raised an even more disturbing question. If she had been following this alternate trail, it meant she had deliberately strayed from her path. Why? Had she gotten lost? But there had been no reports of fog or adverse weather conditions that day, and if she wasn't lost, then was someone guiding her or forcing her? They continued descending, and about a kilometer from the base of the mountain, they found another trace, a small footprint in the dry mud at the edge of a stream. The shape suggested a woman's boot, the size Margaret wore. Beside this footprint were larger marks, definitely male. Tesla's heart raced. Finally, concrete evidence that Margaret was not alone. But the marks were old, eroded by rain and time. It was impossible to determine whether they were from the same day Margaret disappeared or weeks earlier. The expedition returned to town at dusk, and Tesla called a meeting with the men who had participated in the original search. He presented his findings and asked a pointed question. Had anyone explored this alternate trail during the 3-day search? The answer was discouraging. No one had considered it because it led in the opposite direction to Margaret's aunt's house. The searchers had focused their efforts on the direct route and adjacent areas, logically assuming that any deviations would be accidental and short. No one had imagined that Margaret could have voluntarily walked or been led miles in the wrong direction. Tesla then expanded his investigation. He began questioning residents living on properties along the alternate trail. Most were isolated families, living in simple huts surrounded by small farms. These people saw few outsiders throughout the year, and any visitor would be noticed and remembered. One by one, Tesla questioned them, asking if they had seen Margaret or anyone suspicious in the days surrounding March 15th. Most had nothing to report. But then, in a particularly isolated cabin about a mile from Raven Rock, Tesla met an elderly widow named Eliza Drummond. The woman had lived alone since her husband died of pneumonia 3 winters earlier. She kept a few chickens and a small vegetable garden, rarely going down to town except to buy essential supplies once a month. When Tesla mentioned Margaret Hale's death, something changed in Eliza's face. Her eyes narrowed, and she hesitated before speaking. She had seen something, she finally admitted. On the afternoon of March 15th, just before dusk, Eliza was fetching water from a well behind her cabin when she heard voices. This was unusual, as the trail near her property was rarely used. She crept discreetly to the window and peered through the worn curtains. 2 figures were passing along the trail. One was clearly a young woman, wearing a dark dress and carrying a bundle. The other was a tall man, dressed in dark clothes and wearing a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. They walked close together, but Eliza couldn't hear what they were saying. The sheriff felt a surge of excitement. Finally, a witness. He pressed Eliza for more details. Did the young woman seem in distress? Did she seem forced? Eliza frowned, trying to recall her memories of that afternoon. Not exactly, she said. The young woman didn't seem to be struggling or resisting. In fact, she walked strangely, almost as if in a trance, her movements slow and mechanical. And there was something else, something Eliza only realized later. When the 2 figures had disappeared around the bend in the trail, the man wasn't walking normally. His strides were too long, his posture too rigid. There was something deeply wrong with the way he moved, but Eliza couldn't quite put her finger on it. Tesla asked if she recognized the man. Could he be someone from the area? Eliza shook her head. She'd never seen this individual before, and she knew practically every adult male within a 10-mile radius. This was a stranger, she was sure. The sheriff then asked the most important question. Why hadn't Eliza mentioned this before? Why hadn't she contacted the authorities when she learned a young woman was missing? Eliza's response was disturbing. She was afraid. That night, after seeing the 2 figures, she locked all the doors and windows of her cabin and didn't leave until noon. There was something about the 2 people that filled her with inexplicable dread, especially the man. Even now, weeks later, she felt a chill down her spine, remembering the way he moved, as if his limbs didn't completely obey the natural laws of human movement. Eliza was a woman who had lived alone in the mountains for years, who had braved bears and storms without flinching. But that man, that presence had awakened in her a primal fear she couldn't name. Tesla left Eliza's cabin with more questions than answers. Who was the mysterious man? How had he convinced Margaret to deviate from her path and follow him for miles through the mountains? And what was so disturbing about his appearance and movements that had frightened a mountain woman accustomed to all manner of hardship? The sheriff knew he needed to find this man, but he had no facial description, no name, virtually nothing but the testimony of an elderly widow who spoke of forebodings and irrational fears. Try again, continue edit. Part 4. Eliza Drummond's description, vague as it was, gave Sheriff Tesler a new direction for his investigation. He returned to town and began systematically questioning every merchant, innkeeper, and tavern owner in Haywood County. Were there any strangers in the area during those March days? Had anyone seen a tall, dark-dressed man, possibly traveling alone? North Carolina at that time had its share of travelers, peddlers, itinerant preachers, and seasonal workers, but most of these visitors followed the main roads, not venturing into the secluded mountain trails. The answers were frustrating. Some merchants remembered strangers, but the descriptions were vague and contradictory. Their hardware salesman mentioned a tall man who had bought supplies in early March but couldn't recall specific details. The owner of the town's only inn recalled several guests during that period, but none who exactly matched the description. It was as if the mysterious man had appeared and disappeared without a trace, a fleeting shadow in the mountains. Tesler then turned his attention to the county archives. He spent days poring over dusty documents, searching for similar cases that might offer some clue. What he found was simultaneously fascinating and frightening. Over the past 3 decades, there had been at least 6 reports of unexplained disappearances in the mountains surrounding Raven Rock. Most involved lone travelers, people who were crossing the region and simply never reached their destination. 3 of these cases were never solved, and the bodies were never found. The other 3 ended with the discovery of remains under bizarre circumstances. One case in particular caught Tesler's attention. In the year 1896, 16 years before Margaret's death, a young itinerant preacher named Ezekiel Moody disappeared while traveling between 2 small mountain communities. His body was found 2 weeks later in a ravine less than 2 miles from Raven Rock. The circumstances were eerily similar. There were no signs of violence. His clothes were intact, and he was holding a strange object in his hands, in this case a small crucifix made of intertwined twigs that was definitely not his. The doctor who examined the body at the time was unable to determine the cause of death. Tesler dug deeper into the files and discovered something even more disturbing. The sheriff who investigated the Ezekiel Moody case in 1896 was a man named Abraham Coltrane. In official records, Coltrane maintained a professional and matter-of-fact tone, but Tesler also found Coltrane's personal notes scribbled in the margins of documents, observations that were never included in the formal reports. In one of these notes, Coltrane mentioned interviewing a hermit living in the mountains, someone who claimed to have seen Preacher Moody in the company of a tall man dressed in dark clothing walking toward the highest peaks. The hermit had described the stranger as having a peculiar, almost unnatural gait. Tesler's heart raced as he read those words. It was practically the same description Eliza Drummond had given. Could the same man be involved in both cases, 16 years apart? But that would mean the suspect was at least 40 or 50 years old now, possibly older. Tesler searched for more information about the hermit Coltrane mentioned, but the name appeared nowhere else. It seemed that this witness, like so many other aspects of these cases, had disappeared into the shadows of the mountains. Determined to find answers, Tesler decided to do something unusual. He called a public meeting at the Baptist church, inviting all the oldest residents in the area. If there was a pattern to these disappearances, if there were legends or stories that could shed light on the mystery, the elders would be the guardians of that knowledge. On the chosen night, about 40 people attended, filling the wooden pews of the small church. Candlelight flickered on the walls, creating dancing shadows that seemed to heighten the atmosphere of unease. Tesler explained the purpose of the meeting. He described the Margaret Hale case, mentioned previous cases he had uncovered in the archives, and asked for anyone to share any information, no matter how strange or unlikely. There was an uncomfortable silence. People exchanged glances, clearly hesitant to speak. Finally, an elderly man in the last row slowly stood up, leaning on a cane. His name was Josiah Blackwell, and he was 82 years old. He had been born and raised in these mountains, just like his father and grandfather before him. Josiah began speaking in a hoarse but firm voice. The stories he was about to tell, he said, were considered superstition by most people, tall tales meant to scare children. But there was truth in them, he believed. Ancient, dark truth. According to Josiah, Crow Rock was known to the Native Americans who inhabited the region long before the arrival of European settlers. They called it a place Josiah couldn't pronounce correctly, but it meant something like place where spirits pass through. It was considered a place of power, but also of great danger. The Native Americans avoided camping near it and never, under any circumstances, visited the site after sunset. When the first settlers arrived in the 1700s, they ignored the warnings. Some even tried to establish farms near Crow Rock, but strange things began to happen. Livestock disappeared. Children reported seeing a tall man watching them from the trees at dusk. Some people who ventured too close to the rocky plateau returned changed, speaking in a confused voice, their eyes glazed over as if they had witnessed something their minds could not process. Eventually, the farms were abandoned. People learned to avoid the area. But there was more, Josiah continued. Throughout the generations there had always been tales of a being that inhabited the highest parts of the mountains. Not quite a man, though he took human form. Not quite a spirit, though he didn't appear entirely material. The elders called him by different names. The Walker, the Nameless One, the Shadow Guide. They said he appeared to lonely people, especially those experiencing moments of vulnerability or confusion. He had the power to influence minds, to make his victims willingly follow him to the most remote and isolated places in the mountains. There, something happened. Something that resulted in death, but no ordinary death. It was as if the victims were drained of their lifeblood, leaving only empty shells. The silence in the church was absolute. Some people shook their heads, clearly skeptical of Josiah's account. Others, however, especially the older ones, nodded in agreement. They had heard the same stories from their parents and grandparents. Reverend Kirby, presiding over the meeting alongside Sheriff Tesler, cleared his throat uncomfortably. He tried to soften Josiah's account, suggesting that they were merely folk tales born of the natural fear people felt when faced with the immensity and isolation of the mountains. But Josiah wasn't finished. He mentioned something that made even the skeptics sit up and take notice. In the 1860s, during the Civil War, a group of Confederate soldiers was moving through the mountains, trying to avoid Union patrols. 7 men entered those woods. Only 3 emerged, and they were in a state of profound shock. They were found wandering in circles near a small village, mumbling incoherently. It took days for them to regain the ability to speak comprehensibly. When they finally managed to tell what had happened, their story was terrifying. They had camped near Raven Rock, unaware of the place's reputation. During the night, one of their companions simply got up and began walking toward the forest, as if sleepwalking. When they tried to restrain him, he struggled with surprising strength and finally escaped. The other 3 men who disappeared did the same over the following nights, one by one rising from their sleeping bags and walking into the darkness of the forest as if they were puppets controlled by invisible strings. The 3 survivors fled at dawn on the 4th day, too terrified to try to rescue their companions. Try again. Continue. Edit. Part 5. Josiah Blackwell's account left the congregation in a state of palpable unease. Sheriff Tesler, a man of law and reason, found himself at a crossroads. He couldn't simply dismiss the stories as superstition, not when there were so many similarities to the Margaret Hale case and the other disappearances documented in the county records. At the same time, he couldn't include in an official report that he was investigating the possibility of a supernatural entity being involved in the deaths. This would make him a laughingstock and possibly cost him his job. After the meeting, Tesler spent sleepless nights turning the facts over in his mind. He was a pragmatic man, but he was also honest with himself. There were elements in Margaret's case that defied conventional explanations. The impossible distance she traveled, the lack of signs of struggle or violence, the expression on her face when she was found, that transcendent terror Thomas Brennan described, the macabre necklace of twigs and bird bones, the hemlock branch clutched in her hands, and now Eliza Drummond's testimony about the tall man with unnatural movements, echoing descriptions going back decades, perhaps centuries. Tesler decided to make one last attempt to find concrete evidence. He organized a new expedition to Raven Rock, this time with a specific objective. He wanted to excavate around the stone circle, searching for buried remains that might reveal whether the site had previously been used for sinister purposes. He took 4 trusted men with him, including a burly farmer named Marcus Henley, known for his physical strength and unwavering courage. They reached the rocky plateau on a cloudy May morning. Spring had transformed the mountains, covering them with a green blanket of new foliage, but Raven Rock remained somber, as if the season had failed to penetrate the melancholy of the place. The men set to work, using shovels and pickaxes to carefully dig around and within the stone circle. The work was arduous, for the soil was rocky and compact. After approximately 3 hours of digging, Marcus Henley made a disturbing discovery. His shovel struck something that was neither rock nor root. He knelt and began digging with his hands, carefully removing the earth. What emerged from the frozen ground made all the men involuntarily recoil. It was a human skull, small and delicate, clearly belonging to a child or teenager. And there were more. As they continued digging in that particular area, they found more bones, not just from one person, but from several. Tesla felt his blood run cold. They had stumbled upon something far greater than they had imagined. For the rest of that day and part of the next, the men worked methodically, documenting each find. In total, they found remains that appeared to belong to at least 5 different individuals, all buried at varying depths within and around the stone circle. Some of the bones were very old, stained by the earth and the passage of time. Others were relatively recent. Among the bones, they also found disturbing objects. Small amulets made of intertwined twigs, similar to the necklace Margaret was wearing when she was found. Scraps of rotting cloth, a corroded silver medallion with an inscription that could no longer be read, and something even stranger, a collection of small animal bones, mostly birds, arranged in geometric patterns as if they had been part of some kind of ritual. Tesla ordered that all the remains be carefully collected and transported to the city. Dr. Pritchard was summoned to examine the bones. The elderly physician worked for days in his makeshift office, doing the best he could with the anatomical knowledge of the time. His conclusion was grim. The bones belonged to 3 adult women, a female teenager and a child of approximately 10, possibly male. The ages of the remains ranged from very old, perhaps 50 or 60 years old, to relatively recent, possibly a few years old. The news spread like wildfire through the mountain communities. Raven Rock was not only the site of a mysterious death, but apparently a secret burial ground, a place where multiple victims had been taken over the decades. Tesla now faced a much more complex investigation. He began cross-referencing the remains found with missing persons reports in the county archives and those of neighboring counties. Several matches were identified. The teenager could be a girl named Sarah Winters, who disappeared in 1887 while picking berries in the mountains. One of the adult women was likely Catherine Morrison, a widow who disappeared in 1892 while visiting a friend on a secluded farm. The child could be little Timothy Oakes, who became separated from his parents during a move through the mountains in 1879. The other victims remained unidentified, their identities lost in the mists of time. But the most shocking discovery came when Tesla investigated the personal items found among the bones. The silver medallion, despite corrosion, still had a chain attached. When Dr. Pritchard carefully cleaned it with mild solvents, part of the inscription became legible. It was just 2 letters. E and M. Tesla consulted his files and felt a chill run down his spine. Ezekiel Moody, the itinerant preacher who disappeared in 1896. His initials. And according to the records, Moody was known to wear a silver medallion that had been a gift from his mother. This meant that Moody's body, found in a ravine 2 miles from Raven Rock, had been moved. Someone or something had initially transported him to that location, perhaps as part of some ritual, before discarding the remains in the ravine where they were eventually discovered. But why do this? What was the purpose of moving the victims to Raven Rock? And most importantly, who or what had been doing this for so long? Tesla gathered all the evidence and attempted to construct a chronology. The pattern that emerged was eerie. Roughly every few years, sometimes with longer intervals, someone would disappear in the mountains near Raven Rock. Not all victims were found. Some simply vanished without a trace. But those who were found displayed similar characteristics. No signs of violence, strange objects in their possession, and an expression of inexplicable terror. It was as if something were feeding on the region, periodically choosing victims according to a logic humans could not comprehend. The sheriff then made a controversial decision. He hired a folklore researcher from the University of North Carolina, a young assistant professor named Arthur Whitman, who was studying Appalachian traditions. Whitman arrived in Haywood County in June, excited by the opportunity to investigate such a complex case. He spent weeks interviewing older residents, collecting stories, legends, and oral traditions. What Whitman discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. The stories about the walker, or the being that inhabited the mountain heights, were consistent across multiple generations and different families. There were variations in the details, of course, as with any oral tradition, but the core elements remained the same: a tall, shadowy being, movements that didn't seem entirely human, the ability to influence minds and make people follow him willingly. Victims found dead without apparent cause, always in high, isolated locations. Whitman also discovered something interesting in the university's historical archives. There were records of French settlers who explored parts of the Appalachians in the early 1700s. In their diaries, some mentioned stories told by the natives about mountain spirits that assumed human form and preyed on lone travelers. A Jesuit missionary wrote in 1723 about hearing reports of a demon that inhabited the highest peaks, a creature the natives feared more than any wild animal or human enemy. Armed with all this information, Whitman presented a theory to Tesla. Perhaps there was something in the mountains, something neither he nor the sheriff could fully explain with the science and logic of the time. Perhaps the legends were based on something real, something that had existed in that region for centuries, perhaps millennia. Whitman wasn't suggesting it was necessarily a supernatural entity in the traditional sense. It could be a natural phenomenon they didn't yet understand, something related to the geology or peculiar atmosphere of those mountains that affected the human mind in strange ways. Tesla listened respectfully, but remained skeptical. He was a man of law, not an academic or occult scholar. He needed concrete evidence, a real-life suspect who could be arrested and tried. But as the months passed and no further progress was made, he began to accept a bitter truth. Perhaps this was a case that would never be satisfactorily solved. Perhaps Margaret Hale and all the other victims over the decades were just more names on a dark list of unfathomable mountain mysteries. Try Again R. Continue Edit. Part 6. The summer of 1912 brought oppressive heat to the Appalachian Mountains, but also an unrest that seemed to permeate every farm, every village, every lonely mountain trail. The discovery of multiple remains at Raven Rock had transformed what had been an isolated tragic case into something much larger and more sinister. Families kept their children close to home. Travelers avoided routes that passed too close to this cursed region. And at night, in taverns and living rooms, people spoke in hushed tones about what truly inhabited the dark heights of the mountains. Sheriff Tesla continued his investigation, but this time with a different approach. If he couldn't explain the phenomenon, he could at least try to prevent it. He organized regular patrols on the more isolated trails, especially those leading to the highest peaks. He installed warning signs at strategic points, advising travelers not to stray from the main paths and never, under any circumstances, to continue traveling after dark. Some communities established escort systems where no one traveled alone, always in groups of at least 3. But the mountains were vast and resources limited. Tesla had only 6 deputies to cover hundreds of square miles of territory. It was impossible to monitor every trail, every remote pass. And there was a growing sense that, whatever the nature of the threat, it was smart enough to avoid patrols and patient enough to wait for the right opportunities. In August, Arthur Whitman made a discovery in the regional library archives that added another layer to the mystery. He found a diary belonging to a trapper named Nathaniel Grayson, who had lived in the mountains during the 1840s. Grayson was a solitary man who spent months in the wilderness, trapping beavers and other animals to sell their pelts. His diary, written in nearly illegible handwriting, documented his daily experiences, but also contained disturbing passages about strange encounters. In an entry dated October 1843, Grayson described seeing a tall man walking alone along a distant ridge at an altitude no normal human being would have reason to be. What caught Grayson's attention was the way the man moved, with long, uneven strides that covered impossible distances. Grayson observed through his rudimentary telescope and felt an inexplicable fear rise in his chest. He wrote that the man seemed to be searching for something, his head turning from side to side in a way that didn't seem entirely natural. Even more disturbing, Grayson mentioned finding, weeks later, the body of a young hunter who had disappeared from that region. The body was in an oddly arranged position, hands crossed over his chest, and around his neck was a necklace made of twigs and feathers. Grayson was so disturbed by the discovery that he abandoned his traps in that area and never returned. He wrote a sentence that Whitman would emphasize repeatedly in his notes. There is something in the heights that does not belong to the world of men, something ancient and hungry that feeds not on flesh, but on something deeper and more precious. Whitman shared this discovery with Tesla, and the two men spent an entire afternoon discussing the implications. If Grayson was reporting on real events from 1843, it meant the pattern of disappearances and strange deaths stretched back at least 70 years, probably much longer. And if the tall man's descriptions were consistent across all those decades, then they were dealing with something that didn't age or die like normal human beings, or it was a succession of distinct individuals maintaining some kind of macabre tradition or ritual. Tesla preferred to believe the second hypothesis. Perhaps there was an isolated family or cult living in the most remote parts of the mountains, passing down their sinister customs from generation to generation. But even this explanation was flawed. Why had no one ever found evidence of permanent habitation at the altitudes where the victims were taken? Why had patrols never spotted campfires, huts, or any sign of continued human presence? In September, an event occurred that shook the entire investigation. One of Tesla's deputies, a young man named Robert Fisher, disappeared during a routine patrol in the mountains. Fisher was an experienced man, born and raised in the area, someone who knew the trails as well as he knew the way to his own home. He had set out one clear morning with another deputy, Henry Walsh, to check the trails near the base of the mountain where Raven Rock stood. The two men walked together, maintaining constant eye contact, just as Tesla had instructed. But around noon, as they stopped to rest and eat near a stream, Fisher said he needed to leave briefly for personal needs. Walsh nodded and continued eating his sandwich, waiting for his companion to return. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. Walsh began to grow worried and called out for Fisher. There was no answer. He got up and headed in the direction Fisher had taken, finding only dense trees and bushes. He called out again, louder this time. Nothing. The silence of the forest was absolute, heavy, unnatural. Walsh rushed back to the nearest gas station and alerted the authorities. Tesla immediately organized a large-scale search. More than 50 men scoured the area for 3 consecutive days. Sniffer dogs were brought in from a neighboring county. They followed Fisher's trail for about 100 yards beyond the point where Walsh had last seen him. But then the trail simply ended, as if Fisher had vanished into thin air. The dogs became confused, circling, unable to pick up any scent beyond that specific point. On the 4th day of the search, one of the groups found something that sent a chill down everyone's spine. In a small clearing, approximately 2 kilometers from where Fisher disappeared, there was a circle of stones. It wasn't Raven Rock, but a similar formation, smaller but equally precise in its geometry. And in the center of that circle were footprints, boot prints, the size Fisher wore, and beside them, larger, deeper footprints from someone much heavier or taller. The 2 trails of footprints intertwined, as if 2 people had walked side by side, and then simply ended in the center of the circle, disappearing without any logical explanation. Tesla ordered the area excavated, fearing the worst, but they found no body, no bones, and no sign that Fisher had been buried there. It was as if he had walked to that circle and then ceased to exist on the physical plane. The search continued for another week, expanding to ever more distant areas, but Robert Fisher was never found. He had simply disappeared, swallowed by the mountains like so many others before him. The disappearance of one of Tesla's own deputies had a profound impact on the community and the investigation itself. If even trained and armed men working in pairs weren't safe, then no one was. Morale plummeted. Some of the other deputies requested reassignment. Entire families began considering leaving the mountains, moving to more populated areas where they would feel safer. Tesla was desperate. He wrote letters to the governor of North Carolina, asking for state assistance. He explained the situation in detail, including the discovery of multiple remains and the disturbing patterns he had identified over decades. The state government's response was disheartening. They sent an investigator who spent 3 days in the region, interviewed several people, reviewed Tesla's files, and then returned to the capital with the conclusion that the sheriff was dealing with a series of crimes committed by one or more human individuals, likely hermits or criminals living hidden in the mountains. The investigator recommended more systematic searches and offered to send some state troopers for a limited period. But Tesla knew that ordinary soldiers wouldn't solve this problem. Whatever the nature of the threat, it was far more complex and elusive than a simple human criminal. He began to feel the weight of age and frustration. He had devoted months to this case, had seen evidence that challenged everything he believed about the nature of reality, and he was further from a solution now than he had been at the beginning. Arthur Whitman, on the other hand, was more convinced than ever that they were dealing with something extraordinary. He compiled all his research into a comprehensive document, including native legends, historical accounts, patterns of disappearances, and common characteristics of the victims. His conclusion was that the mountains harbored some kind of phenomenon that contemporary science could not adequately explain. He suggested that perhaps there were unique geological or atmospheric properties in the region that induced altered states of consciousness, causing people to act irrationally and put themselves in danger. Try again. Continue edit. Part 7. Autumn arrived in the mountains with its vibrant colors of gold and red, but the beauty of the season couldn't disguise the atmosphere of dread that had settled over Haywood County. Trees shed their leaves, leaving the slopes more exposed, and as winter approached, people prepared not only for the cold, but also for the isolation that snow would bring. Many prayed that with the arrival of the harsh winter, any threats lurking in the heights would also retreat, entering some kind of hibernation until the following spring. Sheriff Tesla, now visibly aged by the pressure of recent months, made a decision many considered desperate. He summoned every willing man in the region and organized a massive expedition to the highest and most remote parts of the mountains. The objective was simple and straightforward: find any evidence of human habitation, any cave, cabin, or structure that might serve as a hiding place for whoever was behind the disappearances. Whether it was a cult, a deranged hermit, or a family of criminals, they needed somewhere to live, some refuge to hide. 63 men volunteered for the expedition. They divided into 7 groups, each with an experienced leader and 5 days' worth of provisions. They brought weapons, ropes, climbing tools, and detailed maps prepared by surveyor Henry Caldwell. The expedition set out on a freezing October morning, ascending various routes toward the highest peaks. Tesla accompanied one of the groups, determined to lead by example and find answers, even if it meant risking his own life. The first 2 days were exhausting, but uneventful. The groups explored deep caves, some of them clearly never before visited by humans. They scaled dangerous cliffs, explored hidden ravines, and investigated every rock formation that might provide shelter. They found animal bones, signs of bears and other natural predators, but no evidence of permanent human presence at the higher elevations. On the 3rd day, one of the groups led by Marcus Henley, the same farmer who had helped with the excavations at Corvo Rock, made a disturbing discovery. In a particularly remote part of the mountain, accessible only by a difficult climb up a steep rock face, they found a wide, deep cave. The entrance was narrow, easily overlooked by anyone not specifically searching, but the interior opened into a natural chamber of astonishing dimensions. Inside the cave, by the light of their torches, the men saw something that made them stop in their tracks. The cave walls were covered with strange markings, symbols none of them recognized. They weren't Native American pictographs, which some of the older men knew. They were something different, more geometric, almost like an unknown language or notation system, and on the cave floor, arranged in circular patterns, were hundreds of bones, mostly animal bones, but also some that were unmistakably human. Marcus Henley knew they needed to document everything before touching anything. He left 2 men guarding the cave entrance and descended the mountain as quickly as he could to inform Tesla. The sheriff arrived the next day with Arthur Whitman, who was eager to examine the symbols on the walls. What they saw confirmed their worst suspicions. The cave was not just a hiding place, but apparently a ritual site, used repeatedly over an extended period of time. Whitman spent hours studying the symbols, making careful sketches in his notebook. He noticed that some of the symbols appeared very old, worn by moisture and time, while others were relatively recent, with lines still clear. This suggested that the site had been used for decades, possibly centuries, by different individuals or groups. The symbols didn't correspond to any writing system Whitman knew, but there were repetitive patterns that suggested some kind of meaning or intention. The bones were collected and examined. Dr. Pritchard, who had climbed the mountain despite his advanced age, identified bones from at least 3 different human individuals among the collection. Some were very old, bleached by time. Others were more recent, still retaining traces of connective tissue. There were also personal objects scattered throughout the cave: rusty buttons, fragments of rotted fabric, a nearly disintegrated child's leather shoe, and, curiously, several small metal objects, including a belt buckle, some ancient coins, and a wedding ring. But the most disturbing thing wasn't what was in the cave, but what wasn't. There was no evidence that anyone lived there permanently. There were no remains of fires, cooking utensils, bedding, or any of the items one would expect in a human dwelling. The cave was used for something, certainly, but not as a home. It was a place of visitation, a place where rituals were performed and then abandoned until the next occasion. Tesla ordered lookouts to be posted discreetly near the cave, hidden among the rocks and trees, with instructions to observe and report any activity. If anyone returned to that spot, they would finally have their suspect. The lookouts took 12-hour shifts, braving the growing autumn chill and the eerie solitude of those high altitudes. Days passed, then weeks, but no one appeared. The cave remained empty and silent, guarding its secrets. Meanwhile, Arthur Whitman continued his research, now with renewed focus. He traveled to libraries in other parts of North Carolina, and even as far as Virginia, searching for any historical reference to symbols similar to those found in the cave. In a university library in Richmond, he finally found something that offered an intriguing, if disturbing, clue. There were records of a heretical European sect from the 1700s, a group that believed in intermediary entities between the physical and spiritual worlds, beings they called world walkers. According to historical texts, this sect practiced rituals that involved offering human victims to these entities in exchange for knowledge or power. The sect was eventually persecuted and destroyed by the church in Europe, but there was speculation that some members had fled to the New World, settling in remote regions where they could continue their practices away from the eyes of the authorities. The symbols described in the sect's historical records bore striking similarities to those found in the cave. They weren't identical, but they shared enough structural features to suggest a possible connection. Whitman felt a wave of excitement and horror at the same time. If his theory was correct, then the disappearances in the mountains were not the work of a single individual or even a family of criminals, but potentially the continuation of a centuries-old occult tradition passed down through generations. He shared his findings with Tesla, who received the information with a mixture of interest and skepticism. Even if there was a cult operating in the mountains, it still didn't explain some of the more bizarre aspects of the case. The impossible distances the victims traveled, the lack of signs of struggle, the expressions of transcendent terror on their faces, the unnatural movements of the tall man described by multiple witnesses over the decades. There were elements that transcended even the explanation of a deranged religious cult. In November, with the first snow already covering the highest peaks, an event occurred that would add another layer of mystery to the case. One of the lookouts posted near the cave, an experienced hunter named Daniel Crawford, came down from the mountain in a state of profound shock. He was shaking uncontrollably, his eyes wide, and it took him several hours to utter coherent words. When he finally did speak, his story was terrifying. Daniel was working his midnight shift when he heard something. It wasn't a normal forest sound, not wind or animals. It was almost like a voice, but distorted, echoing in a way that seemed to come from all directions at once. He huddled behind the rocks where he was hiding, his rifle clutched to his chest. Then he saw something moving in the darkness, climbing toward the cave. It was a tall, very tall figure, moving with that strangeness so many witnesses had described. Its limbs seemed to bend at slightly off angles, its strides covering distances that shouldn't be possible. Daniel wanted to shoot, wanted to scream, wanted to do anything, but found himself completely paralyzed. It wasn't ordinary fear that held him captive, but something deeper, as if his own will had been temporarily disconnected from his body's control. He could only watch as the figure approached the cave entrance. For a moment, in the dim moonlight, Daniel swore he saw the creature's face turn toward him. He couldn't discern any features, only the sensation of being watched by something not quite human. Then the figure entered the cave and disappeared. Try again. Continue. Edit. Part 8. Daniel Crawford's recovery of his motor skills took several minutes that seemed like an eternity. When he finally managed to move again, he stumbled down the mountain in the darkness, scratching himself on branches and rocks, driven by a sheer terror that overcame any instinct to remain at his post. He didn't stop running until he reached the first inhabited cabin, almost 3 miles away, where he banged on the door so hard that he woke the entire family. It was there that he began to scream, recounting what he had seen between sobs and uncontrollable tremors. Sheriff Tesler gathered a group of 15 armed men the next morning and climbed to the cave. They approached with extreme caution, weapons drawn, prepared for any eventuality. The cave entrance was exactly as they had left it. There were no fresh footprints in the thin layer of snow that had fallen overnight, no sign that anyone had passed through. Tesler lit a torch and entered the main chamber, followed by the other men. Everything seemed unchanged at first glance. The symbols on the walls, the bone arrangements on the floor, everything was in its place. But then Marcus Henley noticed something different. In the center of the cave, where there had been an empty space, there was now a new circle of stones, smaller than the others, and within it was an object that made all the men involuntarily recoil. It was the deputy badge of Robert Fisher, the man who had disappeared in September. The metal was polished, clean, almost gleaming in the torchlight, as if someone had carefully prepared it and placed it there like an offering or a trophy. The discovery confirmed that Fisher was dead, though his body had not yet been found. It also confirmed that someone or something had indeed visited the cave during the night, exactly as Daniel Crawford had reported. But how had this entity entered and left without leaving footprints in the snow? How had it evaded the other lookouts posted at various points around the area? These questions remained unanswered, defying all logic and reason. Tesler made a difficult decision. He ordered the cave entrance sealed with stones and mortar. If this place was used for sinister rituals, then he would deny access to anyone who returned. It was a desperate measure, he acknowledged, but he felt he had to do something, anything, to break the cycle of death that had plagued these mountains for so long. 12 men worked for 2 days to completely seal the entrance. Stacking heavy stones and filling the gaps with mortar, they carried up the mountain in buckets. When they finished, the cave entrance was completely blocked, hidden behind a stone wall that blended into the natural rock face of the mountain. Tesler hoped this would be enough. He hoped that by denying access to the ritual site, he could finally stop the disappearances. But deep down he knew it was likely only a temporary measure. If something had been operating in those mountains for decades or centuries, a stone wall would hardly be a permanent obstacle. Winter arrived with full force in December of 1912. Heavy snow blanketed the mountains, making the upper trails impassable. Communities retreated to their homes, burning wood in their fireplaces and waiting out the cold months. During the winter, there were no new disappearances. People began to breathe a sigh of relief, murmuring that perhaps the worst was over, that perhaps sealing the cave had indeed worked. Arthur Whitman spent those winter months writing a comprehensive account of everything he had discovered. He meticulously documented the legends, the historical accounts, the patterns of disappearances, and all the physical evidence he had collected. His work would eventually be published in an obscure academic journal, where it would be largely ignored by the scientific community of the time, dismissed as fanciful folklore mixed with poorly investigated criminal cases. But Whitman knew there was something genuine in it all, something that the science of 1912 simply didn't have the tools to understand or explain. Spring of 1913 arrived sooner than expected. The snow began to melt in March, revealing the mountain slopes and reopening the trails. With the thaw came renewed hope. Maybe, just maybe, the nightmare was finally over. Families began to resume their normal routines. Travelers resumed using the mountain trails, though they still carefully avoided areas near Raven Rock and other locations known for their sinister associations. Tesler organized a verification expedition as soon as weather permitted. He wanted to confirm that the cave seal remained intact. A group of 8 men climbed to the site on a clear April morning. What they found left them stunned and dismayed. The stone wall they had so carefully constructed was completely destroyed. Not simply collapsed by the weight of snow or erosion, but deliberately dismantled. Stones lay scattered around the entrance, as if they had been ripped out by brute force and thrown aside. The mortar was broken into pieces, some of them showing marks that appeared to have been made by hands, fingers that had scratched and dug through the hardened material. Tesler entered the cave with a heavy heart. Everything inside was unchanged, except for one disturbing addition. In the center of the main chamber, there was now an elaborate arrangement of bones forming a complex circular pattern, and in the very center of this pattern sat an object that made Tesler's blood run cold. It was a framed photograph, taken from the Hale family home. The photograph showed Margaret Hale smiling gently at the camera, taken perhaps a year before her death. How had that photograph gotten there? Who had stolen it from the family home and brought it to this cursed place? This further rape, this insult to Margaret's memory and her family's suffering, enraged Tesla in a way he had never experienced before. He practically ran from the cave and shouted to the empty mountains, daring whoever or whatever was doing this to show themselves, to face him directly instead of hiding in the shadows. His voice echoed across the valleys and peaks, but there was no response other than the indifferent silence of nature. The men accompanying him were concerned about Tesla's emotional state. He was clearly at his limit, exhausted by months of frustration and failure. Marcus Henley gently persuaded him to come down from the mountain, arguing that they needed to rethink their approach, that standing there yelling wouldn't solve anything. Tesla reluctantly agreed, but everyone could see that something inside him had snapped at that moment. The realization that he was fighting something he couldn't comprehend, much less defeat, had finally penetrated his defenses of rationality and professionalism. In the weeks that followed, Tesla became a shadow of his former self. He still performed his duties as sheriff, but without the energy and determination that had always characterized him. He slept little, ate even less. His wife worried deeply, begging him to let the case go, to accept that some things simply couldn't be solved. But Tesla couldn't let go. Margaret Hale, Robert Fisher, Catherine Morrison, Sarah Winters, Ezekiel Moody, all those victims and their families, deserved justice. They deserved answers, and he had failed to provide both. In May of that year, something no one expected happened. A letter arrived at the sheriff's office with no return address, the envelope stained and worn, as if it had traveled a long distance or been deliberately aged. Tesla opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message written in elegant but old-fashioned handwriting. The message was short and enigmatic. The mountains remember. The mountains guard. The mountains claim what belongs to them. Stop searching for what you can never find. Embrace the mystery or become part of it. Tesla showed the letter to Arthur Whitman, who examined it carefully. The ink seemed unusual, possibly handmade. The paper was of antique quality, the kind no longer commonly used. The handwriting suggested formal education, possibly from the previous century. But who had written it? And more importantly, was the message a veiled threat? Was the author suggesting that Tesla might also disappear if he continued his investigation? Try again. Continue Edit Part 9. The mysterious letter marked a turning point in the investigation, but not in the way Tesla had hoped. Instead of discouraging him, the message rekindled something within him, a fierce determination that temporarily replaced the despair he'd been feeling. If whoever was behind it was bothering to send warnings, it meant their actions were causing some discomfort, that they were getting close to something important. Tesla decided he wouldn't stop, wouldn't back down, no matter the personal cost. He began a new line of investigation, this time focusing not on the disappearances themselves, but on the region's oldest families. If there was indeed a hidden tradition being passed down through generations, then there must be some family lineage connected to these events. Tesla spent weeks poring over property records, birth and death certificates, and family trees stretching back to the earliest settlers. It was tedious and often confusing work, as the earliest records were incomplete and frequently contradictory, but patterns began to emerge. There were a few families who owned land in the higher elevations of the mountains, properties that had been passed down from generation to generation since the early years of colonization. One family in particular caught his attention, the Corvines. It was an unusual surname, possibly an Americanization of some original European name. The Corvines maintained a secluded property on the upper slopes of a mountain, adjacent to the area where Raven Rock stood. According to records, they had been there since at least 1750. What was peculiar about the Corvines was how little they appeared in official records, considering how long they had been in the region. There were scattered birth and death certificates, but very few other documented interactions with authorities or institutions. They did not participate in local elections, were rarely seen in town, and apparently lived in near total isolation. Property records showed that their land had never been sold or divided, always passing to a single heir in each generation. Tesla decided he needed to visit the Corvine estate in person. He took Marcus Henley and 2 other trusted men with him. The journey to the estate took the better part of a day, following narrow, poorly maintained trails that climbed steadily through dense forests. The higher they climbed, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. The light filtering through the treetops took on an eerie, almost greenish quality. The normal sounds of the forest, birds and small animals, gradually faded until they walked in an unsettling silence. Finally, late in the afternoon, they reached a clearing where the Horrifying estate stood. It wasn't exactly a farm in the conventional sense. There was a dark wooden cabin, built of ancient logs covered in moss and lichen. There were no cultivated fields, no barns, no signs of farming or livestock, just the solitary cabin, with small dark windows that seemed to watch visitors like empty eyes. Tesla approached the door and knocked firmly. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time, identifying himself as the county sheriff. Still nothing. He tried the handle and found the door unlocked. With a glance at his companions, he slowly pushed the door open, which opened with a loud, long creak. The interior of the cabin was dark and cold, despite the late spring season. There was little furniture, just the essentials: a rustic table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed in a corner. But the walls were covered with something extraordinary. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of symbols carved directly into the wood, some shallow and recent, others deep and obviously very ancient. These were the same types of symbols they had found in the cave, but here they were on a much larger scale, covering virtually every inch of the cabin's interior walls. On the table, Tesla found several books and notebooks. He opened them carefully and discovered they were filled with writing, in the same elegant handwriting as the mysterious letter. The language was primarily English, but sprinkled with words and phrases in other languages he didn't recognize. It seemed to be a mixture of personal notes, philosophical observations, and what could only be described as ritual instructions. Tesla began reading one of the passages and felt a chill run down his spine. The passage spoke of the nature of reality, of layers of existence that overlapped but rarely touched. It mentioned entities that existed in these intermediate layers, beings that were neither completely spiritual nor completely material, but something in between. And crucially, it spoke of how these entities needed anchors in the physical world, human individuals who could serve as bridges, facilitating their temporary manifestation in our reality. In return, these individuals would receive knowledge, longevity, and power over other humans. Marcus Henley, who was exploring the back of the cabin, called out urgently to Tesla. He had found a hidden door behind a bookshelf. The door led to a cellar, a deep excavation in the earth beneath the cabin. Tesla carefully descended the wooden steps, holding a flashlight. What he saw in the cellar made him question his own sanity. The underground space was surprisingly large, its walls reinforced with stone and wood, and it was filled with objects belonging to people who had disappeared over the decades. Clothes were neatly folded and labeled with names and dates. Personal objects were arranged on shelves: watches, rings, medals, photographs. It was like a macabre museum dedicated to the victims of the mountains. Tesla recognized some of the items from cases he had investigated. There was the Bible of Ezekiel Moody, the preacher who disappeared in 1896, a doll that had belonged to little Sarah Winters, and yes, more of Margaret Hale's clothes and belongings, including the shawl she was wearing when she left home that fateful March morning. But most disturbing was a series of portraits hanging on a basement wall. They were oil paintings, executed with considerable skill, showing the face of the same person at different ages. It began with a portrait of a young man, perhaps in his 20s, dated 1762. Then there was another portrait of what appeared to be the same man but older, dated 1791, then another from 1823, and so on, a progression through more than 150 years, always the same face gradually aging but never dying. The most recent portrait was dated 1911, showing a man who appeared to be 60 or 70, but with eyes that held a depth and antiquity that belied his physical appearance. Tesla then understood the horrific truth. The Horrifyings were not a family in the traditional sense. They were a single individual, living generation after generation through some pact or method he had learned or developed. And this individual was using the victims of the mountains in some way, possibly draining their life forces to prolong his own unnatural existence. The entities mentioned in the texts were somehow real, and this man had become their servant, facilitating their manifestations in the physical world in exchange for impossible longevity. Tesla gathered as much evidence as he could carry. He grabbed the notebooks, some of the victims' photographs and personal belongings, and ordered his men to do the same. They needed to get out of there before the cabin's resident returned, if he ever did. As they climbed back up to the main cabin, they heard a sound that froze them in place. Footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate steps approaching the open door. Try again, do the final part, and ask to register edit part 10. The four men stood frozen inside the cabin, their hearts pounding as the footsteps approached. Tesla gripped his revolver with sweaty hands, positioning himself beside the door, while Marcus Henley and the other two men retreated toward the corners of the room, also armed. The sound of the footsteps stopped right at the doorway. There was a tense silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity. Then slowly a shadow projected itself across the opening. What came through the door wasn't exactly what they expected. He was an ordinary-looking man, perhaps in his 60s, with graying hair and wearing simple farmhand's clothes. He didn't seem surprised to find strangers in his cabin. In fact, there was something in his expression that suggested he'd been expecting this visit, perhaps for a long time. His eyes, however, had that unusual quality Tesla had noticed in the basement portraits, an ancient depth that clashed with his relatively ordinary physical appearance. The man showed no fear or anger. Instead, he simply sighed, like someone finally reaching the end of a long and tiring journey. Tesla kept his gun pointed and demanded that the man identify himself. The answer came in a surprisingly soft and polite voice, with an accent that was difficult to place, as if it were a blend of many regional influences accumulated over an impossible amount of time. He introduced himself simply as Silas Corvine, though he admitted that it wasn't his original name, just the latest in a long line of identities. He spoke calmly, without trying to evade or resist, as if he were finally relieved to be able to tell his story to someone who might understand, even partially. What he revealed in the hours that followed would be so disturbing that Tesla would never include it fully in his official reports, fearing he would be considered insane. Silas explained that he had come to the mountains in the mid-1700s, fleeing religious persecution in Europe. He belonged to an ancient order that studied the boundaries between different planes of existence, places where reality became thinner and more permeable. The Appalachian Mountains, he discovered, were one such place, especially certain areas at higher elevations where specific geological formations created unique conditions. Raven Rock was one such location, a natural convergence point where the barrier between worlds was particularly fragile. He had made contact with the entities that inhabited those in-between spaces, beings that existed in a form the human mind could barely comprehend. In exchange for serving as their facilitator, as a bridge that allowed their temporary manifestations in the physical world, he received the knowledge of how to extend his own life far beyond natural limits. But there was a price. The entities required life energy to sustain their forays into the material plane, and this energy could only come from living human beings. For over 150 years, Silas had fulfilled his role in that terrible pact. He didn't choose his victims arbitrarily, he insisted, as if that could somehow absolve him of his guilt. He waited for people who were alone, vulnerable, in moments of emotional fragility or confusion. In those moments, the human mind was most susceptible to influence, and he could make them follow him willingly to designated locations. The entities did the rest, draining the life force in a way that left no physical marks, only that transcendent terror etched on the victims' faces when they finally understood what was happening to them. But now, Silas admitted wearily, he was exhausted. More than a century and a half of existence had taken its toll. He had witnessed the world change in ways he never imagined, had seen entire generations born and die while he remained, trapped in a cycle of unnatural renewal, and something inside him, some shred of humanity he thought he had lost decades ago, was finally rebelling against what he had become. Margaret Hale, he said brokenly, would be his last victim. He could go on no longer. Tesla listened to it all with a mixture of horror, disbelief, and strangely, a hint of pity. But the compassion lasted only a moment. He thought of Margaret, her shattered family, Robert Fisher, and all the other victims over the decades. He thought of the lives stolen, the futures denied, the immeasurable suffering caused by this man and his monstrous pact. Tesla knew he could never prove anything Silas had confessed. No court would believe this story, but he had the evidence from the basement, the victims' belongings, the records written in his own notebooks. He arrested Silas Corvine that afternoon, handcuffing him and beginning the long descent down the mountain. As they walked, Silas said little, but at one point He looked at Tesla with those ancient eyes and said something the sheriff would never forget. He warned that breaking the pact would have consequences. The entities he had served would not easily accept the loss of their facilitator. They would find another way to manifest, or perhaps in their fury at the broken agreement, they would cause even worse damage. The mountains remembered. He repeated the words of the mysterious letter. The mountains guarded, and the mountains would always reclaim what was theirs. Tesla ignored the warnings. As a last-ditch attempt at intimidation, they arrived in town at dusk, and Silas was booked into the local jail. The sheriff spent the night preparing his formal charges, documenting everything he'd found at the Horrifying cabin. He knew the case would be complicated, that many wouldn't believe it, but he had enough physical evidence to at least keep Silas locked up while the investigation continued. But the next morning, when Tesla arrived at the jail, he found the cell empty. Silas Horrifying had disappeared. The iron bars were intact, the door remained locked, the windows too small for anyone to fit through. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist, dissolving into thin air during the night. The guard on duty swore he heard nothing, saw nothing. The cell had been occupied when he made his midnight rounds, and it was empty when he checked again at dawn. Tesla immediately organized a search, but he knew deep down it would be futile. Silas had been taken, or had left of his own free will, using methods beyond normal comprehension. The evidence Tesla had collected from the cabin remained, of course, and he carefully stored it in the county archives. But without the accused, without a body to be tried, the case simply could not proceed conventionally. In the months that followed, there were no new disappearances in the mountains. Raven Rock remained quiet. People gradually returned to their normal routines, though always with renewed caution when traveling the isolated trails. Tesla never spoke publicly about everything Silas had revealed that afternoon at the cabin. His official report simply stated that he had found evidence linking a suspect to multiple disappearances, but that the suspect had escaped before he could be tried. Arthur Whitman, however, knew the full story. Tesla had shared it all with him, and the young researcher recorded every detail in his personal journals. Whitman would continue to study the mountains and their legends for many years, eventually publishing a book on Appalachian folklore that included sanitized versions of the Margaret Hale case and the mysteries of Raven Rock. The book had limited circulation,